The peaceful diplomatic mission to the Salkar homeworld had started with high hopes. Humans had been welcomed as guests, eager to forge a relationship with one of the galaxy's most respected and feared species. The Salkar, despite their brutal reputation, had initially agreed to engage in talks with humanity. They'd seen it as a chance to prove their superiority, to extend their influence over a species that was still finding its feet in the galaxy. The humans, led by Captain Anna Grayson, had been cautious but optimistic. They had trained for this moment, their diplomats and military advisors fully aware of the challenges they might face. But nothing could prepare them for the horror that would unfold. It started when the Salkar representatives, seated across from the humans in the grand hall of their capital, abruptly stood and activated hidden weapons. The air was thick with tension as the Salkar soldiers, camouflaged in plain sight, revealed themselves. A single order from their commander, and the room erupted into chaos. The humans barely had time to react. Salkar soldiers, towering and armed with energy weapons, swept through the chamber. The humans scrambled to defend themselves, but their weapons were no match for the Salkar's advanced technology. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire, the smell of burning metal, and the screams of those caught in the crossfire. In the confusion, Captain Grayson's mind worked faster than her body could move. She wasn't just a diplomat. She was a seasoned warrior. With a sharp command, she ordered her security team to activate the emergency protocols. Without hesitation, the humans fought back. Grayson's voice, cold and commanding, cut through the noise, instructing her team to fall back to the fortified positions they'd prepared in case of such an ambush. The humans fought with everything they had: fists, knives, and whatever makeshift weapons they could find. They moved like a well-coordinated unit, pushing back against the surprise attack. They were not trained to face such overwhelming force, but they were determined. Even outnumbered, even under fire, the humans pressed on, using their environment to their advantage, adapting in real time to the shifting chaos. But the true horror came when the Salkar activated their orbital weaponry. The humans' distress signals were intercepted before they could even reach their fleet. The Salkar didn't just want to destroy the diplomats. They wanted to send a message. The first orbital strike devastated the nearby human ships, leaving nothing but debris in their wake. Yet, despite the horror and the overwhelming force of the Salkar, humanity didn't break. Instead, they fought harder. Grayson rallied her team, pushing forward despite their dire circumstances. "This isn't over," she snarled, her voice low and deadly. "We're not dying here today." The Salkar, accustomed to being the predators, were shocked by the human response. They had expected terror, surrender, maybe even confusion. But what they encountered instead was relentless fury. In the heart of chaos, humans discovered a deadly truth. When pushed to the brink, they did not yield. They adapted, they fought, and they would make the Salkar regret underestimating them. By the time the last Salkar soldier fell, the diplomatic compound was in ruins. The humans had paid a heavy price, many lives lost, but they had sent a message of their own. This war, this first strike, was just the beginning. The galaxy had just learned that humanity was not to be trifled with. The Salkar would soon learn that when it came to war, humans did not simply survive. They thrived. The news of humanity's brutal counterattack spread like wildfire across the galaxy. The Salkar, once seen as the most ruthless conquerors in the known universe, were now retreating in disarray. Their fleets, once a symbol of terrifying power, were being torn apart by the relentless fury of humanity's forces. No one had anticipated this. Humanity had been underestimated, dismissed as nothing more than a fleeting species, too weak to survive in a galaxy full of ancient and powerful civilizations. But the humans had no intention of fading into obscurity. Captain Anna Grayson's forces, though battered and broken, were far from done. Their swift response to the Salkar's attack had thrown the aliens off balance. With every victory, the human military grew stronger, more confident, and more determined. Every battle they fought, they learned adapted, and improved. It was as if humanity's greatest strength wasn't their advanced technology, but their ability to push forward despite overwhelming odds. The humans did not fight like other species. While the Xalkar relied on brute force and overwhelming numbers, humanity excelled at cunning, strategy, and most importantly, survival. They didn't just fight to win. They fought to ensure that they never had to face the same horrors again. By the time the Xalkar realized they had underestimated humanity, it was too late. The humans had already launched their first full-scale offensive. Their tactics, honed through centuries of war on Earth, were now being used in space. The human forces spread across the galaxy like a storm, striking where the Xalkar were weakest, hitting them when they least expected it. The Xalkar fleet, which had once seemed invincible, was now scattered. Humanity was no longer a force to be ignored. They fought on every front, raiding enemy supply lines, sabotaging key installations, and disrupting the Xalkar's military operations. For every victory humanity achieved, it seemed the galaxy grew quieter, as though the whole universe was holding its breath. On the battlefield, the humans fought with a savage intensity that sent shockwaves through the galaxy. Alien fleets, once the pride of their civilizations, were reduced to smoking wreckage. Human soldiers, driven by a mix of vengeance and survival, tore through enemy lines with a brutal efficiency. The galaxy's once unquestioned powers now stood on edge, wary of what humanity might do next. Despite the losses, despite the horrors they faced, humanity never wavered. As the Xalkar fleet faltered, other species began to take notice. Some, terrified by humanity's savagery, sought to remain neutral. Others, like the Terri, known for their diplomatic prowess, attempted to mediate peace talks. But the humans, emboldened by their victories, refused. They weren't interested in diplomacy, not yet. They wanted retribution. They wanted to prove that humanity would never be anyone's prey. In one of the galaxy's most pivotal moments, the humans, led by the remnants of Grayson's command, captured a key Xalkar outpost, one of their most powerful strongholds. The destruction was absolute, with human forces laying waste to the Xalkar infrastructure in an almost surgical strike. There was no mercy. There was no quarter. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as humanity's fury unleashed its full potential. The Xalkar, once a dominating force, were now fighting for survival. And every time they tried to regroup, humanity hit harder, faster, and with more devastating precision. The galaxy, for the first time in a long time, was afraid. And they had good reason to be. Humanity was not just a species fighting for survival. They were a species that would make anyone who dared to cross them pay in blood. The Xalkar had learned a painful lesson. Never underestimate humanity. Because once the fury of mankind was unleashed, there was no stopping it. The war between humanity and the Xalkar had escalated in ways no one had expected. The humans, who had once been dismissed as a fledgling species with little place in the galaxy, were now at the forefront of a conflict that threatened to shake the very foundations of galactic power. The Xalkar, having suffered severe losses, were now in full retreat, but the human forces showed no sign of slowing down. The galaxy was starting to realize the full scope of what humanity had become. The fear of humanity's fury began to ripple through the stars. The Xalkar, once the undisputed rulers of the battlefield, were struggling to regroup. Their once unstoppable fleets now found themselves scattered and disorganized, haunted by the ghosts of their failed attempts to crush humanity. In contrast, humanity was growing stronger with each victory. They were unrelenting, adapting faster than anyone could anticipate. As humanity's reputation spread, other species started to take notice, not just out of fear, but curiosity. The Terri, a species known for their peaceful diplomacy, were the first to approach humanity with an offer of peace talks. They had witnessed the destruction wrought by humanity's hands, and they saw an opportunity to avert further bloodshed. However, their approach was met with cold dismissal from the human command. Humanity was not interested in negotiations just yet. They had been attacked, slaughtered, and betrayed. Peace would come on their terms, not on the Terries. The Terri, stunned by this unexpected response, realized something crucial. Humanity was not a species driven by diplomacy or honor alone. They were driven by survival, vengeance, and a brutal desire to carve out a place for themselves in a galaxy that had never given them a chance. The Terri, despite their best efforts, could do little but watch as humanity continued its march toward dominance. But what truly set humanity apart was their ability to evolve. Where other species relied on advanced technology to secure victory, humanity blended their technological progress with their unique talent for adaptability. Each battle was a new learning experience, and the humans seemed to gain strength from every skirmish, refining their tactics, weapons, and strategies at an almost terrifying pace. The humans had a secret weapon, something the galaxy had never expected: their ability to innovate under pressure. When faced with seemingly insurmountable odds, they didn't simply retreat. They fought harder, adapted quicker, and found ways to turn the tide of battle in their favor. The Salkar, who had once thought of themselves as the galaxy's apex predators, now found themselves outmaneuvered and outthought at every turn. As the war raged on, humanity's military leaders, those who had survived the early battles, became legends. Captain Anna Grayson's legacy lived on in the strategies employed by the human forces. She had not just been a fighter. She had been a symbol of human resilience. Her final orders, delivered before her death, resonated deeply within the hearts of the soldiers she left behind. We do not fight for glory. We fight for survival. And we will never let anyone take that from us. The galaxy, once unified in its indifference toward humanity, now looked upon them with trepidation. The Salkar had learned to fear the human spirit, but they were not the only ones. Other species began to question their own strategies and alliances. Could they afford to stand by as humanity grew stronger? Could they ignore the fact that humanity had shattered the carefully constructed order of the galaxy? Whispers began to spread about humanity's true potential, about what they could become if left unchecked. And while some races, like the Vraxen, saw an opportunity to ally with humanity against a common enemy, many others feared that the humans would soon turn their fury on them as well. Humanity had ascended from the bottom of the galactic ladder to a place where they were no longer just surviving. They were thriving. The Salkar had made a grave mistake when they attacked, and now they were paying the price. The galaxy was changing, and there was one undeniable truth. Humanity was no longer a species to be ignored. They were a force to be reckoned with, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The Salkar were reeling from their crushing losses, but they weren't ready to admit defeat. What had begun as a strategic ambush to crush humanity had now become a desperate struggle for survival. The once mighty fleet of the Salkar, now fragmented and scattered, continued to regroup, determined to hold onto their power at any cost. But they were no longer fighting to conquer. They were fighting to survive. Meanwhile, humanity's forces surged forward, propelled by the rage and determination that had fueled their rise. The war had become something more than just a struggle for survival. It had become a war for vengeance. Each battle, each victory, was a small piece of retribution for the lives lost in the Salkar's initial attack. And with every strike, humanity proved that they would never be broken. In the midst of the chaos, Captain Anna Grayson's death had become a rallying cry for the human military. Her name echoed through the ranks, inspiring soldiers to fight with an intensity that terrified their enemies. Grayson had embodied the human spirit, resilient, unyielding, and unwilling to be defeated. And her memory drove humanity to fight harder than ever before. But the war was taking its toll. The human forces, though relentless, had suffered massive losses. Supply lines were stretched thin, and morale began to waver as the cost of victory mounted. Yet despite the mounting casualties, humanity's resolve remained unshaken. They knew what was at stake. The war was no longer just about defending their people. It was about sending a message to the galaxy. Humanity would not be wiped out. Not now. Not ever. The Xalkar, in their desperation, resorted to increasingly brutal tactics. They unleashed bioweapons, devastating entire human colonies in a matter of hours. Cities turned to ash as the Xalkar sought to break humanity's spirit. But instead of succumbing to the horror, humanity responded with an unwavering fury that left their enemies reeling. For every city lost, 100 more human warriors arose to take its place, driven by a thirst for vengeance that no bioweapon could extinguish. In response, the humans began adapting their tactics to counter the Xalkar's use of bioweapons. They developed new forms of warfare, blending their technological advancements with the raw ingenuity that had come to define them. They learned to fight with brutal precision, using the Xalkar's own methods against them. In a savage twist of irony, humanity's creativity and resilience had turned the Xalkar's weapons into instruments of their own defeat. As the war stretched on, humanity's military grew ever more sophisticated. What had once been a ragtag force, thrown together in desperation, was now a disciplined, highly effective fighting machine. The Xalkar, who had once mocked humanity's ability to survive, were now faced with an enemy unlike any they had ever encountered. The humans were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for their place in the galaxy, and they were willing to burn everything down to ensure they had it. Other alien species, watching from the sidelines, began to reconsider their stance. Some of the more neutral races, like the Ziktar, offered supplies and intelligence to the humans in secret, recognizing the power shift that was taking place. The Xalkar, who had once ruled the galaxy with an iron fist, were now losing allies, and their hold on power was slipping. Yet even as humanity's star rose, so did the fear of their wrath. The galaxy was beginning to understand that humanity was not a species to be toyed with. They were no longer the weak, untested race that had been so easily overlooked. They were something far more terrifying, an unstoppable force, driven by the will to survive, and by the unshakable belief that they could win, no matter the odds. As the Xalkar's empire crumbled around them, they realized they had made a fatal mistake. The war was no longer just a conflict for territory or power. It was a war for humanity's right to exist, and they were no longer willing to let the galaxy decide their fate. The galaxy, once certain of its own invulnerability, was now gripped by a cold, terrifying truth. Humanity was coming, and they were not going to stop until the Xalkar were nothing more than a distant memory. The human war effort had reached a critical juncture. The tide had turned in their favor, but victory came at a devastating cost. The Xalkar had underestimated humanity's resilience, but their response was swift and merciless. They unleashed weapons of mass destruction, including biological agents that decimated human colonies in the blink of an eye. The death toll was staggering, and even the most hardened soldiers began to falter under the weight of the loss. Captain Anna Grayson's death had already left a permanent scar on the human military, but it was her final orders, delivered with unwavering conviction before she fell, that continued to resonate across the ranks. We do not fight for glory. We fight for survival. We fight for those who can't fight for themselves, she had said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. And we will not stop until we make them pay for every life lost. The grief over Grayson's death was raw and palpable, but it ignited something within the human forces. The brutal loss became their driving force. Her death, as tragic as it was, steeled their resolve. Grayson had been the symbol of humanity's defiance, and her sacrifice was not in vain. The war had become personal for every soldier, every civilian caught in the crossfire. The blood spilled would not be forgotten, and the Xalkar would pay for it all. In the wake of Grayson's death, humanity's military leaders made a choice that would alter the course of the war forever. They would not retreat. They would not surrender. They would make the ultimate sacrifice if necessary. The fate of their species hung in the balance, and there was no turning back. The Vraxan, a species long enslaved by the Xalkar, watched in awe as humanity rose from the ashes. They had been a silent observer in the conflict, their people broken and scattered by the Xalkar's cruelty. But now, with the Xalkar on the defensive and their strength waning, the Vraxxin saw an opportunity to fight back. They offered an alliance to humanity, pledging their support in the war against their former captors. Humanity, though wary of new alliances, saw the value in the Vraxxin's offer. With their combined forces, humanity launched an assault on one of the Xalkar's most fortified strongholds. The battle that ensued was brutal, a clash of titans that would determine the fate of an entire sector of the galaxy. The human forces, bolstered by the Vraxxin's advanced tactics, fought with unmatched fury. They fought not just for victory, but for the memory of every life lost, every world destroyed. The battle was long and bloody, but humanity's determination proved stronger than the Xalkar's might. The fortress fell, and the Xalkar, for the first time in the war, faced a true defeat. The victory was bittersweet, however, as the human forces had paid an unimaginable price. Thousands of soldiers fell in battle, their sacrifice a testament to their unyielding spirit. But the price of victory only made the message clearer. Humanity would never be broken. The Xalkar, once so confident in their superiority, were now on the brink of collapse. Their forces, once thought invincible, were shattered, and their empire was crumbling under the weight of humanity's fury. In the aftermath of the battle, the humans stood victorious, but the cost of that victory was heavy. The war had taken everything from them: loved ones, comrades, entire worlds. Yet, despite the profound loss, humanity's spirit remained unbroken. They had come to the edge of destruction and had fought their way back. They had proven, in the most brutal of ways, that they would not be erased. And as the Xalkar regrouped, nursing their wounds and plotting their next move, they realized one harsh truth: humanity was a force they could not defeat. The blood spilled in this war had forged something far stronger than their weapons could ever destroy. Humanity was not just surviving. They were thriving. And the galaxy would soon understand that when humanity fights, it is a war no one can afford to lose. The war had now entered its most crucial phase. The Xalkar, once supreme in their cruelty and military prowess, were now stumbling. Their fleets were broken, their strongholds crumbling, and their people were beginning to lose faith in their leadership. Humanity, despite their own immense losses, had become the spearhead of a movement that had turned the tide of the galaxy's war. Their unrelenting assault had shattered the Xalkar's dominance, but the galaxy had yet to fully grasp the scale of what was happening. In the darkest hours of the war, the humans had learned to adapt like no other species in the galaxy. The Xalkar had made the mistake of thinking humanity was just a passing anomaly, but now they realized that humanity was an unstoppable force. With every blow they struck, the humans grew stronger, more determined, and more resourceful. The galaxy was beginning to understand that humanity was no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for supremacy. But the Xalkar were not done yet. As their empire crumbled, they resorted to more desperate measures. The remnants of their once feared military began to focus all of their remaining strength on a single devastating plan. They would unleash their most destructive weapon, one capable of wiping out entire human colonies in a single stroke. It was a last-ditch effort, a calculated move meant to break humanity's resolve and force them to surrender. The humans, however, were prepared. They had anticipated this move, and they had a plan of their own. The Xalkar may have believed that they had the upper hand in weaponry, but humanity had something they could not fathom: ingenuity. The humans had developed a countermeasure, a technology so advanced and so unexpected that even the Xalkar could not foresee its effectiveness. It was a weapon that would disrupt the Xalkar's last-ditch effort, turning the tide of the war once again. The final confrontation came in the form of a battle unlike any the galaxy had ever witnessed. The human fleet, supported by their newfound allies, the Vraxxin, confronted the remnants of the Xalkar forces in the heart of their last stronghold, a massive fortress orbiting a desolate moon. It was a place of legend, built upon the blood of countless civilizations, and the pride of the Xalkar. It was here that the Xalkar had hoped to make their final stand. The human forces, though battle-worn and weary, had one advantage that Xalkar did not: unity. They had come together in a way no other species could. The coalition of human warriors and their allies had become a formidable force, and they had learned to fight not just for victory, but for each other. The battle for the Xalkar's fortress would not be just another military engagement. It would be a defining moment in the history of the galaxy. As the humans launched their final assault on the fortress, the Xalkar responded with all the fury of a species backed into a corner. Their weapon, a planet-destroying device powered by an ancient energy source, was already primed and ready to fire. But the humans did not flinch. With a brilliant maneuver that had been years in the making, they infiltrated the fortress, bypassing the Xalkar's defenses and deactivating the weapon moments before it could unleash its devastating force. The battle that followed was brutal. The Xalkar fought with a ferocity born of desperation, but the humans, driven by a collective will to survive, fought with a precision and determination that left their enemies reeling. The Xalkar forces began to fall apart, their morale shattered by the knowledge that their ultimate weapon had been neutralized. As their stronghold fell, the last vestiges of the Xalkar Empire crumbled with it. The victory was hard-won, and the cost was immense. The human fleet had taken heavy casualties, and many more lives were lost in the final push. Yet, despite the losses, humanity had done what no one thought possible. They had dismantled the Xalkar's power and defeated them once and for all. In the ashes of the battlefield, humanity stood victorious, but not without sacrifice. As the survivors looked upon the wreckage of the once feared empire, they knew that the war was not just about defeating an enemy. It had been about proving something far more important: that humanity would never be subjugated again. The galaxy had seen the brutal might of the Xalkar, but now it would learn to fear the unbreakable spirit of humanity. The war was over. Humanity had won. The war was over. The Xalkar, once the most feared empire in the galaxy, lay in ruins. Their military had been shattered, their leaders scattered, and their great fortress, a symbol of their once unstoppable power, was now nothing more than a charred husk orbiting a lifeless moon. The galaxy, still reeling from the shockwaves of the conflict, had been forever altered by the brutality and ferocity of humanity's rise. But the price of victory was steep, and the cost weighed heavily on those who had fought and sacrificed everything. In the aftermath of the final battle, the human forces stood victorious, but their triumph was tempered by the staggering losses they had endured. Entire fleets had been destroyed, entire colonies wiped out by the Xalkar's devastating bioweapons. The faces of the soldiers, once filled with the fire of determination, now carried the burden of grief and exhaustion. They had won, but at what cost? The cost was visible in the hollow eyes of the survivors, in the empty spaces where once vibrant worlds had stood. It was felt in the families torn apart, in the countless lives lost to the unrelenting tide of war. There were no celebrations, no parades. The victory was hollow, for it was built upon the sacrifice of so many. Yet, despite the sorrow, there was a sense of resolution. The survivors understood that they had done what was necessary to ensure their species would never again be vulnerable. The Xalkar's brutal campaign had been a reminder of the galaxy's cruelty, but humanity had proven that they would not bend. The sacrifices had not been in vain. They had shown the galaxy that they could stand toe-to-toe with the most powerful empires and emerge victorious. However, the war had also left scars, physical and emotional, that would never fully heal. Captain Anna Grayson's death, which had sparked the fire that fueled humanity's revenge, was still fresh in the minds of the soldiers. Her name had become a legend, a symbol of everything humanity had fought for. But the war had taken something from them that would never return: the innocence of a species that had once been naive to the brutal realities of the galaxy. Humanity now stood at the crossroads of a new era. They had emerged from the ashes of war stronger than ever, but they also faced the daunting task of rebuilding. The Salkar's empire had fallen, but the galaxy was still a dangerous and uncertain place. Other alien species, once content to remain neutral, were now eyeing humanity with suspicion. Some saw them as a rising power, a force to be reckoned with, while others feared that the human thirst for vengeance might turn on them next. In the ruins of the Salkar's stronghold, the leaders of humanity gathered to discuss what came next. The Terrai, who had once sought peace with humanity, now extended a hand in diplomacy, hoping to avoid further conflict. But the humans, wary and scarred by the war, were cautious. They knew that alliances could be fragile, and that trust was something earned, not given. The Vraxin, who had fought alongside humanity, stood by their side, but even they could sense the change. Humanity had proven their strength, but their willingness to forgive and forget was far from certain. The survivors of the war, though exhausted, were determined to rebuild. The lessons of the conflict were not lost on them. They had learned that survival was not enough. To thrive in the galaxy, humanity would need to forge its own destiny, not depend on the mercy of others. They would rebuild their worlds, restore their colonies, and create a future that was free from the threat of annihilation. The galaxy, for all its vastness, had never seen anything like humanity. No longer the fragile, weak species they had once been. Humans were now a force that could shape the future of the cosmos. Their rise had been swift, their victory hard-won, and the scars of their journey would remain forever. But they had proven one undeniable truth: humanity could and would survive. And as they looked toward the stars, they knew one thing for certain: the future of the galaxy was no longer in the hands of the Salkar or any other empire. It was in humanity's hands, and they would guard it with the ferocity of those who had fought and bled for it. The galaxy, once fractured by the brutality of the Salkar and the chaos of endless war, now found itself on the precipice of a new era. Humanity had emerged victorious, their enemies vanquished, their name now whispered with both fear and respect across every corner of the stars. The dust of battle was beginning to settle, but the scars of war would never fade. What had begun as a desperate fight for survival had transformed into something far greater: the birth of a new power, one that would shape the future of the galaxy. As the survivors of the war gathered to rebuild, they did so with a profound understanding of what they had accomplished. The destruction of the Salkar had not just been the collapse of a tyrannical empire, it was the dismantling of the old order. The days of blind subjugation, of fear and conquest, were over. Humanity had shattered that world, replacing it with something new, something they could control. The galaxy would no longer be a place where the powerful ruled unchallenged. Now, the power would be shared. In the aftermath of the war, the human colonies began to thrive once more. Rebuilding efforts were swift, aided by the technology and resources seized from the Salkar's fallen empire. Yet even as the infrastructure of their worlds rose from the ashes, humanity's leaders knew they could not return to the way things had been. There would be no more endless wars waged for dominance. Humanity had tasted the true cost of power, and they would not seek to repeat the mistakes of the past. As the leaders of humanity met in the heart of their newly established capital, they faced a question more daunting than any battle they had fought. What would the galaxy look like under their rule? Would they become another empire, like the Salkar, whose thirst for control had led to their downfall? Or would they forge a new path, one that ensured peace and cooperation, where the old ways of the galaxy could be unmade? The decision was not made easily. The scars of the war still ran deep, and the temptation to dominate was strong. But humanity's greatest strength, what had driven them to survive against all odds, was their ability to evolve, to change. And so, after much deliberation, they chose a path that would forever alter the galaxy's future. They would not rule by fear. They would lead by example. A new council was formed, a coalition of representatives from humanity and their allies, including the Vraxin and Terrai. This council would guide the galaxy into an age of cooperation, ensuring that the mistakes of the past were not repeated. It was not a perfect system, and it would require constant vigilance. But it was a start, a new beginning for all who had suffered under the Salkar's reign. Humanity, once an insignificant species struggling for survival, had become the catalyst for a new galaxy. They had not just defeated the Salkar, they had ignited a revolution in the hearts and minds of every species that had witnessed their rise. The universe had learned that humanity was not a race to be underestimated. Their survival, their will to endure, had transformed them into something no one could ignore. As the years passed, the memory of the war faded, but the lessons it had taught were etched into the very fabric of the galaxy. The Salkar were no more, their empire reduced to dust, and the galaxy, though scared by their legacy, was free to chart its own course. And at the center of this new galaxy stood humanity, not as conquerors, but as stewards, guiding the future with a sense of purpose and responsibility. In the quiet moments of reflection, as the humans gazed up at the stars, they knew one undeniable truth. They had proven their place in the universe. They had faced the darkness, and in the end, they had become its light. The war was over, and a new dawn had arrived. Humanity had not just survived the galaxy's cruelties, they had shaped it into something better. The future was theirs, and with it, the promise of endless possibilities.